welcome to the debate.
Glad to be here.
Our focus today is really on the architecture of executive power. Specifically, how should we fundamentally interpret Article 2 of the Constitution? Does the text primarily define the presidency as, well, a limited office dedicated to execution and legal administration?
And this is the other side, does the very aggregation of constitutional duties inherently thrust the president into the role of the nation's primary policy engine? The broad agenda setter.
Exactly. And this tension becomes, I think, particularly sharp when you compare the precise constitutional language, the shall faithfully execute, against the really expansive modern ways presidents talk about their goals. You see it on White House websites defining national priorities, like, say, unleashing American energy dominance or securing our borders.
Right.
And my position is essentially that the president's constitutional identity is and should be narrowly anchored in the rule of law. The framers designed an administrator, fundamentally, not a sovereign policy architect.
And I come at it from a different angle. I argue that those core strategic powers, specifically the diplomatic and military authority granted in Article 2, they do more than just administer. They inherently require the president to define the national agenda. I see it as a matter of constitutional necessity, really, driven by the functional requirements of the office itself.
Okay, well, let me lay out the evidence for the president as primarily an administrator. I think the foundational identity of the office comes directly from the presidential oath in Section 1, to faithfully execute the office and, crucially, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Now that sounds to me like a fiduciary duty, a duty of fidelity and maintenance. It doesn't really sound like an invitation to initiate broad, maybe partisan policy shifts. Then the dominant duty, I think, is cemented in Section 3. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. This clause is, you could say, the gravitational center of Article 2. It emphasizes fidelity to existing law, to statutes passed by Congress, not the invention of, new sweeping national agendas. So when contemporary executive offices focus on policy outcomes, things like lowering costs for all Americans, they seem to be prioritizing a political goal over the specific, sometimes quite mundane, statutory delegation required by that take care clause. Even the sort of high-level duties in Section 2, granting pardons, appointing officers, making treaties with advice and consent, these are fundamentally administrative or managerial functions, and they require institutional checks, which reinforces the role as an officer within the system, accountable to the laws, not some self-declared architect of national policy.
Maybe think of the president as the CEO implementing the board's strategy, not the sole proprietor deciding the company's whole direction.
That's a powerful analogy, I grant you. But I think it drastically undersells the sheer scope of the powers Article 2 aggregates in one person. While the duties of execution are certainly undeniable, the Constitution also grants powers that I believe necessitate the definition of a national strategy. And this makes those modern policy goals you mentioned actually a requirement, not an overreach. Look first at the military power. The president is the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. That power establishes the president as the singular decisive authority in matters of national security and military policy. Now, that isn't a clerical or administrative task. It's a profoundly strategic function. It requires the articulation of national goals. I mean, how can you command the armed forces without first defining why and how those forces might be used? That strategy, that policy definition, it's just inherent to the job.
Okay.
And perhaps even more crucially, Article 2 doesn't leave this policy recommendation role just to implication. Section 3 explicitly mandates that the president shall, from time to time, give to the Congress information of the State of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. Now, I submit that this last phrase, necessary and expedient, is pretty much the constitutional definition of setting a policy agenda. You simply can't recommend necessary and expedient measures without first establishing national priorities. And furthermore, the duty to receive ambassadors and other public ministers, well, that establishes the president as the sole voice and face of U.S. foreign policy, requiring the articulation of strategic priorities like, the stated goal of restoring peace through strength. Foreign policy, just by its nature, demands agenda setting.
I certainly acknowledge the historical weight of the State of the Union address, and yes, the power of recommendation is there. But let's look closely at the wording again. Recommendation is advisory, isn't it? Not mandatory for Congress to follow? The tension remains, for me, between the power to recommend and that strict, mandatory duty to take care that the laws be executed. If the president's fundamental duty is strictly to execute the laws Congress passes, where exactly does Article 2 grant the authority to unilaterally define these sweeping, national policy aims like lowering cost for all Americans, often completely outside of a clear statutory basis?
Right. When a president defines goals like, say, energy dominance or climate change mitigation as a major priority and then uses that goal to justify broad executive actions, well, those goals often appear to usurp the legislative function, don't they? They focus on policy outcomes, the what, rather than the administration of specific, delegated tasks, the how, which should be derived from statutes passed by Congress. This, I worry, shifts the executive function away from legal compliance towards political initiation.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the modern act of setting a national goal is inherently legislative usurpation. The role of recommending measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient, that provides the exact constitutional mechanism for defining priorities. This clause allows, really requires, the president to survey the massive landscape of the federal government, especially, the post-New Deal administrative state, and provide coherence and direction.
Coherence.
Yes, coherence. The policy goals we see today, securing borders, energy independence, whatever they might be, they're simply the modern manifestation of those necessary and expedient measures. They serve a vital function, providing directional clarity to the vast executive branch structure, and frankly, justifying the use of executive actions. These actions are often necessary, I'd argue, to ensure that existing laws are implemented efficiently and consistently with the president's view of national necessity, especially when Congress has passed vague or maybe even outdated legislation. To suggest the president must operate without a defined national purpose, well, that seems to ignore the functional reality of a, $6 trillion government.
And that might be the exact point of contention. Functional reality versus constitutional mandate. Does necessity, however real, supersede the specific structure defined by the framers? Let's drill down on the scope of the diplomatic and military power again. You argue these powers necessitate strategy, and I agree, strategy is involved. But strategy isn't necessarily the same thing as policy formation. Strategy informs how you execute existing mandates or use existing powers.
But how can the president faithfully execute the role of commander-in-chief or be the sole receiver of ambassadors without an overarching national strategy? These powers are fundamentally strategic, not purely administrative. I mean, consider the historical shift post-World War II or during the Cold War. Imagine a vacuum of leadership in defining a cohesive national strategy like containment, for example. It would have been disastrous. The president is really the only office capable of defining that kind of national security strategy quickly and decisively. I mean, does the Constitution really expect the president to wait for a 535-member body to authorize a major shift in foreign policy doctrine when faced with an immediate threat?
I certainly acknowledge that historical necessity has often required prompt, sometimes unilateral action in crises, but isn't that perhaps the founders' masterstroke? To give the president massive strategic power, yes, but then tie their hands somewhat on implementation precisely to prevent the executive from becoming some kind of monarchical policymaker?
Tying hands.
Look at the structured checks embedded right there in the Constitution. The president still must rely on the Senate for treaties, requiring a 2/3 concurrence, no less. They also rely on the Senate for appointments of ambassadors and other key officials. These structural requirements, they demonstrate that even these highest-level strategic functions are checked, they're structured, they demand consultation and, yes, administration, not solely unilateral priority setting. And that bit about how the president may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments, that suggests a managerial accountability structure focused on administrative duties, even when discussing the most strategic matters. The purpose seems to be coordination and management, not unfettered political agenda setting.
Wait, I have to push back slightly on that framing. You're focusing heavily on the checks on the president's power, which, okay, are vital for separation of powers, absolutely, but you're sort of overlooking the initiation of that power. The president initiates the treaty negotiation. The Senate then responds. The president decides the strategic deployment of the military. Congress controls the funding, often later. The necessary sequence of events really requires the president to define the strategic priority first. Just because there are checks doesn't magically turn a strategic leader into a mere paper pusher.
Okay, fair point on initiation, but consider also how much space the framers dedicated in Article 2 to reinforcing the structure and, importantly, the impermanence of the office. This focus on procedure, succession, the strict limits on compensation, removal via impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors, all this reinforces the view of the president as a temporary, accountable officer, bound by specific legal rules, not an unconstrained national leader driving policy based on, transient political objectives.
Sure, accountability is key.
Right. And the limits on compensation, for instance, no increase or decrease during the term, no other emoluments, that ensures the president can't easily be corrupted by congressional favors or external forces. This focus on ethical and legal boundary keeping, it reinforces the identity of the president as the chief law enforcement and administrative officer, tasked with maintaining the system, not fundamentally restructuring national policy on a whim.
I agree that the structure is crucial for accountability. But if the framers were so concerned with confining the president to mere execution, why did they also embed the necessity of a single decisive leader right into the text? I'm thinking here of the power to fill up vacancies during the recess of the Senate, or the power to convene or even adjourn Congress in case of disagreement between the houses.
Emergency powers, perhaps.
Well, are they just administrative gap fillers? Or are they instruments of national stability and, yes, policy stabilization? They seem to require the president to make significant, sometimes policy-level judgments when other branches fail to act, or when speed is absolutely required. These are moments where the president is arguably required to be the decisive national leader, setting immediate policy, even if it's temporary, to ensure the continued functioning and security of the government. This capacity for decisiveness, especially in moments of inter-branch gridlock, it fundamentally elevates the role beyond that of just a chief clerk, doesn't it?
So, to summarize my position then, while I fully acknowledge the constitutional right, even duty, to recommend measures, the fundamental character of Article 2, emphasizing the oath, the take care clause, the structured checks on appointments and treaties, it points, I think, rather inexorably toward a president whose primary duty is the faithful legal execution of power. The president is an officer of the laws, prioritizing administration and legal fidelity over these broad, often self-declared political priorities that can venture pretty close to legislative territory.
And my summary is essentially this. The president, by constitutional design, possesses unique, singular powers. Commander-in-chief, chief diplomat, the ability and duty to recommend measures that necessarily elevate the office beyond mere administration. You simply cannot fulfill the functions of national security or conduct global diplomacy effectively without strategy, without setting priorities. Therefore, the contemporary articulation of broad national policy goals isn't an overreach. It's a direct, perhaps required consequence of exercising the strategic and agenda-setting duties laid out right there in Section 2 and Section 3 of Article 2. The office, especially in the modern world, requires policy definition to function effectively.
Well, it's certainly clear that both interpretations are deeply rooted in the text of Article 2. It forces us to weigh the importance of those defined constitutional checks and procedural fidelity against the necessary scope of executive leadership that seems implied by the office's core strategic and military powers.
Indeed. And I suppose the debate continues so vigorously in our political life precisely because the Constitution provides such a sturdy framework for both visions, the rigorous administrator and the strategic agenda setter. It really leaves us, and future generations, to determine where that balance of power should ultimately reside.